Hey everyone, welcome to Writing for Your Life this evening. It's second Tuesdays. I think it's second Tuesday of April. I hope it's the right night. I'm really glad you all can join us. I'm really pleased to have Kate Rademacher here with us this evening. Kate and I are good friends. We've collaborated on multiple fronts. We'll talk about some of that this evening. One of which is the Writing for Your Life Dig Deeper a la carte conference coming up May 9th through 13th. Kate and I are doing a session of that together, and then Kate is doing a session on her own. But independent of that, let me tell you a little bit about Kate. Kate is a writer, a international public health expert. She grew up in Boston and now lives in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She graduated from Wesleyan University and the Gibling School of Global Public Health at University of North Carolina. She's the author of 3 books. First one is Following the Redbird, First Steps into a Life of Faith. The second one is Their Face is Shown, a foster parent's lessons on loving and letting go. And the third book is Reclaiming Rest, the promise of Sabbath, solitude, and stillness in a restless world. And as I said, Kate and I work together on conferences, on blogs, on other projects that we can't talk about yet, Compassionate Christianity, yada, yada, yada. So I'm very glad, Kate, to have you here with us this evening.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you all for coming. I'm so delighted to be here. I love everything Brian does, and just really excited for this conversation. The topic that I was hoping to talk about is being a bivocational writer. And to be totally transparent with you all, this is a topic that I've thought a lot about because I consider myself to be bivocational. But this is the first time that I'm sort of taking the show on the road and doing a session on it. So I'd really love it to be very interactive and for you to be giving feedback, and I'm learning, as we go. So this is really exciting for me to be here.
Just so everybody knows, you can feel free to raise your hand through the Zoom interface, to ask a question, or you can type something in the chat box. In the former case, I'll call on you. In the latter case, I'll read your question out loud so it'll be heard and recorded. So either way is perfectly fine. Kate, you can share your screen anytime that you want to, and we'll go from there.
Great. I told Brian I didn't have a couple of slides for tonight. Can you see that, Brian?
Yep.
Okay. And how's that? Still good?
Sure.
Okay, great. So what I think I'd like to do is I'm going to start with actually a bit of a reflection exercise for everybody. And if you have a piece of paper and a pen, that's great, but you can also just do it mentally. So I'm just going to put some words up on the screen here. I hope you can see them. I'm also going to read them off. So these are just some words, and you don't have to resonate with all of them. Part of this exercise is to think about which of these words sing to your heart. So if you have a piece of paper, maybe jot them down, and I'll just read them off. Identity, vocation, avocation, hobby, day job, and calling. So again, if you have a piece of paper, just without like really thinking about it much or judging yourself or second guessing yourself, just put things that you've done in your life, or and especially that you're currently, that's currently a part of your life, or that you're discerning on, maybe the future part of your life, put things in there. And hopefully writing will show up somewhere on here, because I know that you all have come to this writing workshop. So, and I'll just be quiet for a minute. Think of all domains of your life: personal, professional, faith-based, etc. And just sort of start to populate this. And really what I want you to be listening for is which of these words resonate with you of those. Okay, great, thanks. So again, most of us, hopefully all of us, have some kind of interest in writing, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. So let's just use that kind of as our grounding discussion item. So if people are comfortable, either come off mute. That would be my preference, because let's see, can I see the chat in this share screen? Okay, I can see the chat. So either put in the chat or, come off mute and say, where did you classify writing? Where did you put writing in these 6 domains? Go ahead. Yep. Go ahead, Dorothy. Just come off mute and people can just kind of call it out. Oh, you're still on mute though.
Okay. As a sense of calling.
Okay. Calling. Okay. And we have some coming in the chat. Thank you. So we have calling, vocation, calling, and identity. Interesting. Calling and retirement. Nice. Okay.
Vocation.
Go ahead, Sarah. Sorry.
I said vocation.
Vocation. Okay. Calling and hobby. Interesting. Okay. This is an interesting. Calling. All right. So it's interesting to me that the word calling is the most, seems to be the most. And honestly, that's a word that I really resonate with too. I don't want to put you on the spot, Tracy, but I'm interested that you have both calling and identity. Do you want to say anything about that?
Sure. I think because I initially struggled with the calling side, I think that I may have always wanted to be a writer, therefore I identified myself as one. And then as I began to write, recognized that it was a calling to be fulfilled. And there's a space sometimes where I struggle with fulfilling that calling, if that makes sense.
Yep. And that totally makes sense about the calling. And I think what's interesting to me, and again, maybe this is a question of reflection. I was just meeting with a friend, a family member over the weekend, and we were talking about, do you all, this is a rhetorical question, do you all identify, as a writer? Is that part of your identity? I think that's an interesting question to think about. Calling in certain seasons, some have identified me as a writer or containing gifts in this area. Identity again. So does anybody who feels that the word identity or vocation, again, the talk tonight, I'm going to be using the word vocation a lot. So does anybody who uses either want to talk about identity or vocation as it comes to writing? I'm just curious what these words, evoke for different people.
Hi, my name is Barbara Pinckney, and good evening. And I have my writing under identity, because I don't separate my life. It's like, trying to find the right words. It's like, it's a part of me. I don't see it, not even though I do other things, because I do have kids ministries. I teach I teach Bible school for kids. I tutor kids in reading because I want them to love reading like I do. I read a lot. I'm in a book club. It's just a part of all the other parts of me. I think that's how I want to say it.
Okay, thank you. That's beautiful. Okay, well, what I'm going to do is pause on the discussion now, and we'll have more time for discussion. I do have what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit more about my story and how I think about these words playing out, and in particular, some of the challenges I've encountered. So I think, just to share with you all, I think of vocation and calling as very tied. So I'll personally talk about a vocational calling. And so again, we can get into some of the semantics of this. I'm not sure the semantics totally matter. But I'll tell you a little bit about more how this played out in my life. So I, as Brian briefly said, have a very busy, very demanding, very fun, rewarding career in public health. I've worked in public health for a little over 20 years. I spent about 10 years working domestically in the United States. I ran a program for adolescent girls living in public housing that was a pregnancy prevention program. I started a new media literacy program focused on sexual health and negative media messages of gender. And then I shifted about 15 years ago to working in an international space. So for the past 14 years, I've worked at a very, very large NGO called FHI 360. I currently am the project director for a big grant funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, trying to expand access to contraception in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's been a really rich and rewarding and demanding career. Keeps me busy. About 11, 12 years ago, I concurrently and separately from that path felt myself very unexpectedly called in a new direction, and that direction was to the Christian faith. I was raised as a Unitarian Universalist, but not as a Christian. So I grew up going to church, but it was a UU church. And for those of you who know the UU tradition, it was a very perspective, multi-faith background, and I wasn't raised as a Christian. I'm married to a Buddhist, so I have a very sort of diverse and quirky faith background. But again, about 11, 12 years ago, I very unexpectedly found myself being called to Christ. And 10 years ago, it'll be this Saturday, the Easter Vigil before Easter, I was baptized 10 years ago. And in my Episcopal church in Chapel Hill, where I'm still a parishioner. And 7 days later, I was confirmed as an Episcopalian by Bishop Michael Curry, who at the time was the bishop of the North Carolina Diocese and is now, of course, the Archbishop of the American Episcopal Church. And so, but more surprising even than that, all of that surprised me. God knocked my socks off and totally surprised me by calling me to life in Christ, which was not the plan. Yeah, you know how God rolls. That was a surprise, but more of a surprise. A couple months after I was baptized, I felt this undeniable call to write about the journey, and I just could not deny it. It was so strong, and so that call turned into 3 books. So first, I published my first memoir, "Following Red Bird," as Brian said, in 2017. About a year and a half later, I published a second memoir called "Their Faces Shown" about my experience as a foster parent, but through really as a sort of meditation on faith. And then this past summer, I published my third book with Broadleaf Books on Sabbath keeping, reclaiming rest, which Brian mentioned. So, I really have, both of these vocational callings, these paths have been incredible gifts. And what has made it complicated for me and confusing is that when you are a writer, and Brian and I have, as he mentioned, we have a session on this called Marketing as a Spiritual Practice. When you are a new writer in today's current writing world, publishers expect that you will build your own platform. So that means that you have to be, as a writer, actively a co-creator and engaged in building a platform, meaning ways and places that you can connect with current and potential readers so that you can help sell books, essentially. So, and at the same time, in my field in public health, we don't use the word platform. That's not the semantics we use. But what we use in my field in international public health is we say we're expected to be thought leaders. So thought leaders is an amorphous, a term that includes many things. It means publishing in the peer literature. It means, being a presence at meetings. It means being a thought leader, having big ideas and advancing them in the community. And in the world of social media, it increasingly means engaging on social media in thoughtful ways about public health content. So I was sitting here going, nobody tells you these things clearly. You have to figure it out for yourself. But I'm sitting here going, if I'm going to really do this, I have to have a platform as an international public health person and a platform as a faith-based writer. And those two things don't have a lot of overlap, right? Like in some domains there do. There are plenty of public health organizations that do faith-based work. Faith-based organization, the late Paul Farmer, who just passed away, was a giant, true giant international public health, and was a Catholic and deeply animated by his faith, founded Partners in Health. So, there are, of course, places where these things overlap. But oftentimes, these things don't overlap, and that's where I was. So, and then meanwhile, I was a parent. I am a parent. I have a daughter, a former foster daughter, a stepson. So I'm a bivocational mother as well. I'm a mother, stepmother, and former foster parent. And so one of the reasons I put parenthood up here as well is I know a lot of people who say, well, you're multi-vocational, like parenting is one of your vocations. And to me, being a parent is more like an identity. Like it's deep, it's even deeper than, and that's how I think of it. It's like, it's part of who I am at my deepest core as being a parent. Whereas my public health and faith-based writing do absolutely feel like God-filled, God-informed, and God-guided vocational callings. And I have awareness that vocational callings can change. God can call us in new directions and often does. So, I understand that I've always understood that could evolve as the Holy Spirit sort of vision, called to me evolves. So the good news is that I got some wise counsel. This really stressed me out. Like, I want to be a good, I took Brian's classes. I was a good Writing for Your Life student. And I was like, I know I need to build a platform. I want to do it. And there are some really very real risks for me to do that because, again, part of being a thought leader in my work in international public health is not just it having impact. It is raising money. And, I have to be have a reputation as a thought leader and a leader in public health because I applied for, $2 to $80 million grants. That's our, I'm working on a grant that's for right now for $2 million, and I'm part of a grant that's $80 million from USAID. So this is like big money and big stakes. So how do I do this, but without sort of risking my reputation in one domain as I work on the other? And also, people don't get this. I don't fit into a box, right? And so I don't know if any of you like resonate with that, but I don't really fit into the typical box of a faith-based writer. And then in this sort of international public health world, most of those colleagues and friends are not doing what I'm doing, which is having this side hustle of, this robust writing career. So, I'm a weirdo, but it's fun to be weird, right? Maybe. Okay. So, oops, sorry. I didn't mean to do that. So a couple of lessons learned. Okay, so then one of the big ways we establish a platform is on social media, right? And so I had a really helpful conversation as I was struggling with all this as my first book was coming out following my bird. I had a really good session. I hired Rochelle Gardner. So one thing I would say is as you're trying to figure these things out, talk to smart people. Brian Elaine is one of the smartest people I know. Get up with him. You're already doing that, so good for you. I also hired a woman who Brian partners with sometimes, Rochelle Gardner, who's a book agent, but she also does coaching and consulting on the side. So I hired her for a couple sessions as a coach. And she said something that really helped me, which is she said, you don't have to be all things in all domains. She said, if you go to church with your daughter or you pick your daughter up at preschool, in that situation, you are a mother. You don't go in to pick up your daughter at preschool and say, oh, here I am as this or that. You're just a mom, right? Likewise, if you go to work, people may know you're a parent, but you're not talking about it. So it's okay to be different things in different domains. And she said that doesn't make you inauthentic. And that really helped me because I'm very, committed to being an authentic and integrated person. And she said to me, you are an authentic and integrated person. And that doesn't mean you can't do different things in different domains. You are the one who's authentic and integrated, and then you can move in these different spaces. So what I did was intentionally made a decision about how to use my social media platforms. So I use my regular Facebook page, my regular, typical Facebook page that we all have as my sort of just personal page. I post some about writing, but I don't really think of it. I'll post when my books come out, or I post something about this, but it really, it's more personal. Then I have an author page on Facebook that I use for posting more content about my writing. Then looking at Twitter and Instagram, I decided to send most of my Twitter feed on my public health work. A lot of my public health colleagues are engaging on Twitter. So I'm mostly, and I'm going to talk about how I've kind of started to break down some of these silos and barriers over the last couple of years. But I decided to focus Twitter on my professional work and Instagram on my faith-based work. And again, Rochelle Gardner was really helpful there. She said a lot of, faith-based women writers are active on Instagram. That's a good platform for you to use for that. And then I used LinkedIn, again, very actively for my professional career. So I think one of the things that really helped me is to think about how you can engage differently on these different social media platforms and almost have a different voice on different ones. Oops. Okay. So this is something Brian and I were just talking about briefly before we got on. So I think nobody ever talks about income, or rarely. And so this is just a very simple schematic. I didn't put any numbers here. I'm not revealing how much I'm earning or anything. But just to say that, I make my money, my income, my revenue from my public health work. That's what I get a paycheck. It's my day job. Now, I'm very, very, very blessed because I have felt a deep sense of vocational calling around my public health work. I think it's totally legitimate to have a day job that it doesn't feel like a vocational calling. That's, simply to pay the bills. And then you're focusing your other time on your vocational calling. That's like legitimate. But I think it's good to be clear with oneself, where does one's income come? After, it's about 7 years of writing and publishing 3 books, I make almost no money on my writing at this point. And that's fine. I basically about break even. I invest money on things like developing a website, attending great conferences like with Writing for Your Life, working with coaches like Rochelle Gardner, all of which, is not inexpensive, but I love it. I want to do it. And to me, it's meaningful. And so, that's okay because I have income from this other, from this other space. And then what I've really struggled with, and again, this is an important takeaway from my remarks of being a bivocational writer, is that like, because of this, because of the orange box and the purple box, there's this sneaky little feeling that I get, which makes me feel like my writing should just be treated as a hobby, right? So that my work, my day job is my, real thing, and then my writing is a hobby. And that's kind of how we conceptualize it in sort of like traditional American culture, right? But I'm telling you, I feel that, honest to goodness, that both of my public health work and my writing feel like vocational callings from God. So I've really had to work hard inside myself to validate that, right? Because nobody's going to validate that for me, because certainly the amount of money that I get, and my husband doesn't help. My husband comes and says, how many books have you sold? Did you get your check from Broadleaf? Have you earned your, have you earned your $3,000 advance back yet? And it makes me feel bad, right? Because it's like, it feels like I adore my husband. He's totally a supporter of mine. But it makes me feel like it's not as important or something. But that's not true. It is a vocational calling from God. And what do you do when you get a vocational calling from God? You listen and you obey. That's what I believe. So you listen and you obey, and as faithfully as you can. And that is what I've done, and it's been an incredible gift. The other thing I was telling Brian, and again, this graphic may need a little work, but just to put a fine point, or what's the phrase, to bring home the point, obviously parenting is not a revenue generating activity, right? So revenue, when it comes to parenting, I'm not, this has not been a win for the revenue. It's been a cost.
Now, is your daughter in college yet?
No, it's going to get worse.
Right.
It's going down before it goes up, right? She's a 10th grader. So luckily my stepson is out of college. He's actually got a real job, so that's good. He's off my balance sheet. But so, like, again, I put this on here intentionally because, again, if anybody says to you or says to me, oh, that sounds like a nice hobby, but it's a vocational calling, it doesn't matter what the ledger says. It matters, and again, this is God's economy we're talking about, right? God's economy, Brian and I were just talking about this, that in God's economy, we work in the language of love and impact and service and connection, right? And of course, we all need to pay our bills too, absolutely. And so it's not that, income generation is bad. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it's honoring one's bivocational identity. Okay, so something really interesting has happened to me in real time in 2022, which I'm going to tell you about, and this can be like a case study we look at, which is evolving in real time. So for the first time, my public health work and my faith-based writing are starting to intersect in this very surprising and interesting way, which I'm going to tell you about. And so now this is changing the dynamics, and I'm starting to think about how to potentially change my platform, my external facing platform, and even potentially my revenue model. Before I move on and tell you what's happening, again, so that you can be thinking about this as a case study, I also want you to see that I haven't, parenthood has not overlapped, but that hasn't. But let's say, my last book, my faith-based writing book, was about Sabbath. There certainly could be tons of things I could be doing with parenthood and Sabbath keeping. There's a lot of, interesting things to say. I have a chapter about that in my book, about like, how do you parent, how do you bring the Sabbath ethic to parenting, etc. So the Venn diagram could start to overlap in that space, but that's not.
Let me interrupt for just a second, because I had another interview today with Jennifer Grant.
Yes, perfect.
She was specifically had that overlap. Her very first book that she ever wrote was about adopting a child. So it's exactly the point that you're making about the overlap there.
Right. And I could have done that. So with my second book, you have to be very strategic about these things. I wrote a book about being a foster parent. Of course, I could have positioned that as becoming a foster care expert, right? But I made an intentional decision that I didn't feel called in that way. And so I made a choice not to go in that direction. So there are all these different intersections we could explore if we're bivocational. So I'm just, again, I don't want to get into the detail. I mean, I'm going to give you a sort of taste of the details here just so you can see how it's playing out. And it's, again, in real time. I'm happy to take suggestions. You can use me as a little workshop, a little, real-time workshopping. So, in addition to doing my day job and my writing, in 2020, I was invited to join a leadership program called Women Lift Health. And as part of that, we were all required to do a leadership project. So what I decided to do was take the Reclaiming Rest book on Sabbath, which I was writing, and sort of pivot that and put it into a public health lens. And so I started researching, and I was doing a lot of this research anyway for my book. So I started looking at the issue of burnout as a public health issue. So that when I did was I have the slides, I'll show you a couple of the slides from my slide deck, and I started giving a couple of little talks. So I gave a little talk at work, and then another little talk, and then one more little talk. And at the third talk, one of my division directors was there, and she said, I want you to come speak on this topic. This is so important to the leadership team. And suddenly this topic has gone viral at my organization. It's a large international NGO. We have 4,000 people worldwide. People are so exhausted and burned out. Now I'm getting all these invitations to talk to a lot of different people, and I even got some internal funding to lead an anti-burnout initiative, which is very funny to me, especially because I'm on the verge of burnout. So this is my first slide. I talk about this, and what's been really interesting is I have kept my lives totally separate. I have never mentioned my writing at work because of all the anxieties I mentioned a couple slides ago. So very few of my colleagues know about this, what I call my side hustle or my bivocational life. But now I'm leaning into it. And it's so interesting to me, and this, Brian, you'll appreciate this. When I met with Rochelle Gardner 5 years ago, I said to her, should I start to do this? Should I be publicly? And she said, not yet. It's too soon. But she said, there may be a time when you start to merge your platforms. And that is happening right now. And so that's another lesson I would say as a bivocational person. It doesn't happen all at once. We talk about Kairos, or God's time, right? We talk about having patience. So, as we're building these platforms or building our vocational work, it doesn't happen overnight. And so I asked Rochelle Gardner that 5 or 6 years ago, and now I start to see how these things are coming together, but it took a while. So again, when I give this talk, I talk about how burnout was classified in 2019 for the first time as an occupational phenomenon by the World Health Organization. That got a lot of press. Of course, that was before the pandemic. So the problem has only gotten worse since the pandemic is coming. I have this slide where I have illustrative quotes from colleagues around the world. You can just see a couple of them. I think working on that last grant proposal nearly broke me. I don't think I can just keep doing this for another 20 years. I have to work over Christmas this year to respond to your donor's request. So I won't read them all, but the one I want to point you to is in like about 6 o'clock on the screen. Maybe our daughter's generation will figure out how to balance it all. We certainly haven't. And I actually opened my book, Reclaiming Rest, with this quote, which is from a colleague. And you can see my daughter there. So the talk I've been giving at work is saying, I wrote this book, and one of the main motivators of me writing this book is that sentence that a colleague said to me a decade ago. And she said, we haven't figured out how to achieve work-life balance. Oh, well, maybe our daughter's generation will figure it out. And what I feel and what I wrote in my book and what I'm saying to people is that doesn't sit right with me. For us just to say, well, we haven't figured out how to achieve work-life balance. Let the next generation take on this problem. No, I want to at least try to figure this out so that part of my legacy to my daughter and to her cohort of peers is that we, have some potentially answers about how to do important, meaningful, impactful work and not burn ourselves out in the process. And to be honest with you, I really don't think we figured this out. I don't think anybody's figured this out. It's really a problem, it seems like, that is endemic in our society. So here's why I am, right? Suddenly my vocations, you can feel it, right? I can feel it. I don't know if you all can, are starting to overlap. And now I have the potential to speak more about this and to take the show on the road, right? So then we go back to the revenue model and the social media model. What's next? Maybe what I'm playing with the idea of is potentially starting to build up, maybe, again, don't tell my boss, she kind of knows already. So, consultancy gig where I'm starting to think about, talking about burnout in this context. And so then my writing would just be, and this is again the big aha for me related to the other talk, which is writing as a spiritual practice, which is your writing becomes part of your platform. You're not developing a platform to sell your book, right? You're not building a platform to sell your blog or to sell the essay that you presented, that you published in X magazine or whatever. People don't want you to sell them stuff. They want you to help them. Brian, I just said it, right? People need help. And if you have something to offer them that can help them, that's what they want. They don't need to be saying, oh, wow, great job, Kate. She just got published, just got a blog published. I mean, they love me if it's my friends and family they do, but what people who don't know me need is they need help. And if I have expertise, or if I have encouragement to offer, or if I have inspiration to offer, or if I have entertainment to offer, now they're listening, right? So again, as we think about being bivocational and we are offering our gifts to the world, we're saying to people, how can, what do I have to help you? And our writing is a part of that. But and I think, I think Barbara, it was you, I think, who said it. It's like, it's like part of our ministry and our vocational offering. You can't parse these things out. So if you're, doing a reading ministry and then you're doing a writing ministry and somehow they kind of intersect in interesting ways, that's what you're kind of offering to the world. And then you're sort of talking about that in a coherent way. So I know this is a lot.
So Kate, I don't know if you saw, there's a question from Vivian asking you about how you segregate your time for writing.
Thank you, Vivian. So that is another good question. And I meant to have a slide on that. I apologize. I didn't bring up that sooner. So, I mean, this is a huge question for anyone who's bivocational. How do you make time for it all? Right? I mean, that's probably the number one question. I probably should have started with that. So I'll tell you the truest answer, and then I'll tell you the practical answer, okay? The truest answer is I had no choice. Like, the writing had to happen. I was talking to a friend of mine who's having the same experience, like the writing just grabbed her by the throat, and she's like, it feels like being pregnant, and the baby is coming whether you want it or not. So for me, that's how the writing felt. It's like these books were in me, and they were, I'm not trying to say it didn't take a lot of work, didn't take a lot of diligence, it didn't take a lot of conscientiousness, it did. But it felt like it was full of the Holy Spirit, like it was just something that had to happen. Now, if you don't feel that way, like if you feel like you should write a book, but you don't really feel that energy, just like pause and maybe like examine that, because if you feel like you want to write, you really want to write, but you don't necessarily have the call or energy or the call really to write a book, there's so many other ways to share your writing with the world. And writing a book takes a lot of work. It is time consuming. So, really, I think going back to that, like that sense of vocational call, because if you have that calling from God, I think it's harder to ignore it than it is to listen to it. So that's my truest answer. My practical answer is twofold. One is you have to write in the cracks of time, and you have to find chunks of time. Okay, and I'm plagiarizing this. I'm stealing this from colleagues at Hope Writers, which is another great writing platform. And I read a couple of essays on this and heard this, which is I love this idea of cracks of time. And that's how it was for me. I think a lot of us have this fantasy that we're going to go off to the writing retreat where we're served organic food, we're going to go with our girlfriends or whatever, drink wine in the evenings, and then we'll write 6 hours a day. That is not practical for me. That is not how it's happened. I mean, if you can do that, that sounds fun and fabulous, great. But for me, I would like drop my kid off at school and like be driving to work, have an idea at the red light, like pulling over, writing ideas on receipts in my purse. Like that's what I'm talking about, cracks of time. I would pull over, drop my daughter off at school, sit in the park near her school and write for 20 minutes. I would, work for an hour or two at night after work. So I think I would say, don't wait till you get the perfect, pristine, long, concentrated time to write. Write in the cracks of time. But you also need chunks of time. I also like to call them caverns of time. So what I would do is, but I was not fancy about it, right? So this like writing workshop I'm describing to you, again, if you have the resource, the time and the resources to do that, or the community to do that, wonderful. I know lots of people who do it that way. I think I'm just much more like get practical and like get the job done. So what I would do is I would go on Priceline or some other online platform and get myself a cheap motel room, negotiate with my husband to take 36 hours away, and then go take myself on a retreat and go sit in a, motel room 20 minutes from my house, which was a great vacation, don't get me wrong, buy snacks in the snack machine, yeah, maybe I'll go get a burger for dinner or whatever, but just write for 36 hours. And it was just very practical. And, so that's how I did it. So again, that was a lot of information. I see Phoebe's hand raised. Do you want to come off mute?
Yes, please. So thank you for this really interesting and enlightening presentation. I want to ask a similar question, but it's not about the time. It's more about the energy, because I have actually, believe it or not, a kind of similar background to you in that my career was and is in international development, but I'm on the education side, not on the health side. And I say was in the sense that I was full-time and traveling and all of that. And then when I had children, when my children were really young, I knew the traveling part wouldn't work very well. So so I switched to consulting. But there are times when I've actually pulled back from the consulting because I felt like international development, this field is it needs a lot of passion and a lot of like mental energy and even spiritual energy. I mean, you're in it also, like it's kind of a calling in a sense, this work, when you're working with people who are facing injustice and impoverished. So there's so much of that energy that you have to throw yourself into it, that sometimes I worried that if I persisted, with putting a lot of time into this, and sometimes it did happen that I would be so tired from the emotional, mental energy of whatever the work is in the international development field, that I didn't have the energy for a while to do the writing. You know what I mean? So I wanted to know how, because you still do it full time. You do that full time, and then you also write. How do you manage your energy, emotion, both like your physical energy, because that is a lot of work, and then also like your emotional energy, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, totally. So first of all, thank you for that question. Really interesting on multiple levels. And I mean, I think it's no coincidence that I was called to write a book about Sabbath, right? So I'm struggling in real time with these issues. Like, I'm a passionate person, sounds like you are too. I know many, probably most of us are, with a lot of different interests, and the work is endless, right? So how do we manage our energy and our time? And that's what my entire book about, reclaiming rest is a meditation on, which is how do we, again, for me, it's been a very deep look at my hubris, really, which is like that I can sort of save the world. And if I just keep working endlessly, I'm going to, get closer to that goal, as opposed to really the humility of saying, I am not God, I cannot save the world. I am not the savior, and again, not that I go around saying that to myself, but sort of these like implicit assumptions we have. And that Sabbath is really is the sort of mechanism of my ongoing conversion, because when I pause to rest, it teaches me, like the world will not stop if I stop. And in fact, if I stop, it reminds me of who I really am, which is a child of God. And that, that my work is important, but it's not that important. So all during writing my book and working full time, I took a 24-hour Sabbath. So just as an aside, for anyone who says like they cannot afford to take a Sabbath, I just would, I think it's possible now. You can do it in different ways. That is let me come back to that question about Sabbath discipline and whether I do writing on my Sabbath. That's an excellent question. I love that, Phoebe, I love that you use the word, it's Phoebe, right? Yeah. I love that you use the word energy. I just want to point you to this Harvard Business Review article, How to Manage Your Energy, Not Your Time. It's a little bit dated, but I just love that concept of how do you manage your energy, not your time. And so again, like I do have a flexible job work environment. So, I've worked a little bit on the sides today in the middle of my workday, but like I'm getting my job done, and so I do like manage my time and my work in sort of like flexible ways, I guess is one way of saying it. But I have to say, also things change as you get older. I'm 44 and I can feel my energy, my sort of energetic metabolism is shifting. And so I don't think even Brian knows this, but last summer I started playing around with writing a novel. And
No,
so
I did not know that.
it's a secret. You all are the first to know. Family. And it's just really fun. I actually, Brian, you'll really appreciate this. I pitched a nonfiction book to the colleague that you and I were just talking about this afternoon, and she did not think that the concept worked as a nonfiction book. And I was like, I really think God's calling me to write on this topic. And so last summer I went to Vermont, I was like, I just had this sort of insight. Well, what if I turned it into a novel? Like, what if I, wrote about the same themes but in novel? So I spent my vacation but what I'm realizing, and for those of you who are novelists, I'm not, I don't think you can write a novel in the cracks of time. I think I would need much more substantive chunks of time. So I'm thinking about that myself. Like, again, these are all about choices. Like, do I make the time in my life to write a novel? That seems crazy, but is God calling me that way? I don't know. So again, maybe what I would say is the answer to all of this is discernment, prayerful discernment, and that's actually something I was rereading. Somebody I quoted in Reclaiming Rest, A.J. Saloba, and he says that Sabbath is the cure to compulsivity, and I think I tend to be a person who sort of just jumps, somebody asks, I say yes, or, and the Sabbath, the sort of pause and prayerfully discern where God is calling you to co-create. I think that's another piece of insight I would have. But I'm figuring it out in real time too. I want to come back to Jenny's question, is writing part of your Sabbath discipline? That is a great question. So again, the way I define, think about, as I, again, wrote Reclaiming Rest and gave this a lot of thought. What is Sabbath? It's for me, it's taking a break from work, right? So it's a pause from work. It's a rest from your work. So I think what I advise in my book and what I would share tonight is reflect on what constitutes as work for you. So for me, writing is part of my vocational work. And so then, yes, I do not write on the Sabbath. Now, sometimes I might feel a little tempted to, and then the reality with Sabbath keeping in modern life is that there aren't rules, right? We're not in an agricultural society where work is clearly like, farming your land, right? So in these places where our work is much more nebulous and sometimes I'll discern that for various reasons without going into detail, I'll do a little bit of writing on the Sabbath, but typically what I'll do then is just hand, writing in a notebook, not in a computer. So, thanks for the book information. Other questions or comments? Again, I know I threw a lot at you and that my situation is unique, but hopefully there were some insights that were useful. Do others want to jump in with comments or questions? Sarah, do I see your hand up?
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah. Well, what you just said about farming the land, I've thought of writing architecture before, that even if it's the humanities, that there's a reality to it, that you can do it right and reach people, and that if it doesn't work out, it's like a building being destroyed. But do you think you mentioned about farming, that's a different analogy. I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts about the skill of finding the market for the writing and all of that? Is it something that can be chosen, or is it full of factors that you can't control?
Wow, good question. I'd be curious what others people think too. I mean, I definitely think there's factors you can't control in writing and in marketing, right? So you can, actually it's interesting you say that, Sarah, because one of the things in my last chapter of Reclaiming Rest, it was time to wind up the book, and it was time to wind up my own sort of thinking and reflection on this topic. And I really was struggling still to sort of, because really what the book became on was a meditation on sort of who is going to save the world. Is it humans. And again, from an international public health perspective, we're in the middle of a ongoing global pandemic. You know, there's a strong temptation to say, if we just work harder, we're going to get through this, which is certainly true that is certainly true. And my cousin, who's a nurse midwife, I talked to her about it, and she said, I think the thing you're forgetting about is the power of grace. She said, I'm a nurse midwife. And she said, I don't make the babies be born. You know, I help, I facilitate, they provide medical intervention, but I don't create, it's a grace beyond me. Similarly with farming, the farmer may, prepare the soil, may plant the seeds, but the farmer isn't the one to make the plants bloom. So I think that message of the power of grace, and in all of our work, the ways that the Holy Spirit moves through us and in us, the moments of grace that we, feel, that's something obviously we can control. And also, I mentioned this earlier, some of the timing, Kairos is time, God's time, the concept, I may be mispronouncing that, Kairos. If there are any pastors on the line, y'all can correct me. So anyway, that's just one reflection.
I mean, for what it's worth, Kate, I think there's a huge amount of what matters in our lives that are beyond our control, right? There's the kinds of things, that you see every day, but then there's all the underlying things about where you were born, when you were born, who you were born to, yada, 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 right? I mean, plus all of the things that affect us, kind of on a daily basis. So, Sarah, for what it's worth, I just think that there's a huge amount of factors that
this made us sound like I'm sucking up to you, which it is. But I mean, when I went to a Writing for Your Life conference in Bali, I think 6 years ago, it was a total game changer for me. I walked in that door and I was like, when people say like you find your tribe, I think when I walked into this Writing for Your Life conference, I was like, I feel the sense of homecoming that I have not felt elsewhere. So thank you for that, Brian.
It was because of Barbara Brown Taylor. That's
well, more than Barbara Brown Taylor. It was also you and other folks I met that weekend. Is it Sejana? Did I pronounce that right? Okay.
Yes, that's right. Can you say a little bit more about when you were talking about when you were talking about the two circles before they got joined together, and I made a note that you said, I need to do this, but not risking my reputation. I think you're probably alluding to the fact maybe advertising your faith would somehow risk the $2 and $80 million grants that you were, which is a lot of money. So could you talk more about how you are where you are now? I know you I know it was the burnout interest that sort of helped it to be okay that you are a person of faith who also works in this area. But is there did you, as you thought about talking about that topic, was there any thought about how could I apply my faith and public health? And then that came out and people took it and ran with it? Or did it just happen that you just touched on a topic that everyone just sort of resonated with? And then I'm just curious, because right now you're speaking as a person of very confidently and openly about your faith. So how did you move from being a little concerned about it to now, I know this is years later, but how?
You're you're beautifully insightful. And yes, that's exactly what happened. What you said was right. And I mean, I think honestly, I think a lot of the fears were in my head, I think is part of the answer. They were in my head for sure. I grew up in an extremely secular environment outside of Boston that was, my mother was blatantly hostile to religion. My mother is my mother is awesome. She's a social justice activist for 50 years. My mother has been a rockin' social justice activist for nuclear disarmament, criminal justice reform, really serious and important topics. But she is allergic to Christianity. And so I have this very deep, deep feeling of like stigma. And that's not, I know maybe many of you don't have that feeling. You were raised in a very different environment. But so yeah, I was fearful that people would reject me and that they would not take me as a serious evidence-based person. And it just took time. I have a spiritual director. It took, growing in my own confidence. It took the Women Lift Health program, none of which, I did this amazing cohort of 30 amazing professional women. I know a couple of them quietly have faith lives, but none of them are open about it or talk about it. And I think at just some point it got tiresome. It got tiresome of being like small. And I'm just, got tiresome of being small. And so I don't know, this is like, new for me. I'm just being more bold. Now, and there's been no negative consequences. Like, I think if I was like talking about Sabbath at work, that would not be cool. But the fact that I can talk about burnout at work, but then I'm making the bold choice, or not the bold choice, but for me, it's brave. I'm making the brave choice to not just treat it as a secular topic, but I'm making the, intentional and strategic choice to very lightly weave in my faith. But when you see my full slide deck, what I do, again, I'm just telling you like it is. I have a slide on my faith perspective, and then immediately the next slide is about racial and economic justice. Because again, I want to immediately combat the stereotype that a Christian is not about justice, which of course we all know is, but that's the stereotype that I'm fighting in myself and in others. So this is evolving for me in real time. And I think all that I can ask for is y'all's prayers and, keep, praying for myself or with my, keep praying on it. So I hope that makes sense.
Well, can I add, talk a little bit about this too? Just to, follow on, Sujana's question, you did not like strategically think about burnout as the goal, as the thing that'll go viral, to marry these two topics together. But you positioned yourself because of all your work on Sabbath for that to happen. So I just find there's so many things in life where, you position yourself to be in the right place at the right time and let God take it from there, and you never know what's going to happen. Things will spring out of the blue that you cannot predict in advance. And sometimes they're bad, but sometimes they're like awesomely good.
And, I work hard every day.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And again, I think, Brian, you do this too. And Dorothy, I see your hand. So, I think I work hard every day to be a person who's reliable and conscientious and hardworking. And so, like, again, if people trust you, then I think you can play with the edge.
Yes, absolutely.
You're a trustworthy person. If people didn't trust me and I had that slide, they might land differently. But if they trust me and then I'm pushing an edge in a professional secular work environment, I'm using my credibility strategically to push an edge. Does that make sense? Dorothy?
I've written a note to myself a couple different times that I need to write a book about the power of trust, the speed of trust. Even though people have already written about that, Stephen Covey wrote a book about that. It was several years ago. But that concept that you just described is so powerful in everything that I've done, that it just needs to be fleshed out more.
Well, and maybe it's particularly relevant for people who are bivocational, because if you're just in your lane, then people trust you to be in your lane. But if you want to go off brand, that's what it feels like I'm doing. It feels like I'm going off brand. So if you want to go off brand and people are like, what? I just can't understand that quickly. It's not cogent. You have to, but if they trust you, then I think you can go off brand and they'll go with you to a certain degree, not all the way. Does that make sense?
Well, it certainly gives you an opportunity to have them listen.
Yeah.
Right? You've got a door that's open. Whether it works out or not is another story, but at least, So I know Dorothy's been waiting to ask something. So Dorothy, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad I joined today. And Kate, thank you for sharing your story and all of your inspiration. this is a very elementary question that you covered a bit at the beginning, and I feel very ignorant. I know we've talked about creating platforms, and it's just over my head. I'm on Facebook, but Twitter and Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm unaware of how to create a platform on those different medias. And so I'm just going to put it out there and say I need help.
So absolutely. I mean, we're out of time now. I think we're wrapping up, but I mean, I would just say, I mean, I'm not, again, it sounds like I'm a paid advertiser for Brian, but this is high trust relationships. Brian has great content on Writing for Your Life about how to engage on social media in a way that's authentic. And, again, Dorothy, I'll tell you one quick thing that Rochelle Gardner taught me, which is a part, it's a thought partner with Brian, which is if you're doing other writing, if you're doing writing, an easy way to do it, you've already written that content, is to take that content and turn it into little memes. Use a program called Canva, Canva. It's free. It's beautiful graphics. Let's say you've written a sentence or two that are compelling and succinct on your topic. Again, you have to define what your topic is. And that.
Would you repeat the resource, please?
Sure. It's Canva. I'll put it in the chat. And you can make really just nice, very simple or very, elegant graphics. And, take a couple of sentences of your writing, turn it into a little block of text that is graphically appealing, and post that on Instagram, along with photos of yourself, So one day you have a picture of yourself, again, whatever your topic is. And Brian is a genius at this, and again, we can talk more about this. But let's say I'm building a book, I'm selling my book about Sabbath, or I have a book about Sabbath. So yesterday on Instagram the other day, I in real life got a fortune cookie that said, if you have fun this weekend, you're going to get more done afterward. So I put that on Instagram. I took a beautiful picture of it, and I said, I think that this fortune cookie is telling me to take a Sabbath. It just reminds people that I have a book about Sabbath. It's not pushy. It was fun. Simple.
That's great. That's great.
So how do you create an Instagram?
It's very easy. Again, probably beyond the scope of our time tonight, but you can, just like signing up for Facebook or.
Yeah, it's just another account, just like a Facebook account or a Twitter account or Instagram account. It's just something you just sign up for.
And I like Instagram, Brian, and everybody, partly it's like what platform sings to your heart more. I like Instagram. It's very aesthetic. It's Facebook is more of sort of a cacophony of, articles, and the way Instagram's set up, it's a little bit more elegant, I think. So it just depends on what you like. Have fun with it.
Okay. Thank you.
My kitty cat has joined us. She likes being on Instagram.
Animals and children are always welcome to all Writing for Your Life events. So that's a given. So Sajana just put a link in there about, is that about signing up for Instagram, Sajana? Good, thank you.
I'll just maybe as we wrap up, I'll just put out I'm available if anybody wants to talk about these topics further. I'll put my email in the chat. I'm happy to keep dialoguing or to be a resource to folks. I'm not an expert, Dorothy, on social media, so that's not me. But as these sort of how to navigate complex, platforms and thinking about who you are in multiple names. If anybody wants to further engage on that, just let me know.
And I do have a Business of Being a Spiritual Writer class coming up in June. It's an online course, over a period of 4 days, 2 hours per day, where we talk a lot about marketing strategy and marketing tactics and things like that. I'm also going to be doing an in-person one in Denver, June 9th. So we have a Writing for Your Life in-person conference, first time in over 2 years, in Denver, June 7th and 8th, the United Methodist Church there. And then on the 9th will be a separate Business of Being a Spiritual Writer class. So if anybody's interested in seeing Barbara Brown Taylor or Philip Yancey and other really great people, check it out. I'm hopeful, that going back to in-person conferences works again, having not done it for a couple of years. But anyway, enough of that.
Thank you.
So any last questions before we sign off? Okay, thanks so much for leading this. This is just such a rich conversation. And I know there's going to be a recording of it that people are going to get to watch. And I think that it's just really going to add a lot of value for folks. So.
Well, and I would just say, I would also really love feedback. I mean, if anybody wants to send me an email, just say, did this topic work? Again, y'all are my kind of guinea pigs. This is the first time that I'm doing this talk, and I'm going to do a version of it for the a la carte conference of Brian. So I would really welcome your honest feedback, including if it was just too much or whatever. But what I really want to say is I've been struck that, most writers I know actually are bivocational. I don't think many people call themselves that, but I think it's very rare that somebody is just, a writer 100% and that's it. So, also in terms of like making money. So I think most writers are doing multiple things, multiple side hustles. And so I do think that this framework of like, how do you manage multiple vocational identities is important, at least that's my hypothesis. So again, I welcome your feedback.
All right. Well, good. Thanks so much, Kate, and thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. We'll have another session a month from now. Marilyn McIntyre, really another excellent author, will be leading us in May. It's hard to believe it will be May already, but there we are. Yeah. So thanks again, everyone. Appreciate you all joining us. And thanks so much, Kate.
Take care. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.